This is the Asphalt ST. It's a new cruiser style commuter from Mokwheel. That's the brand that brought us the Basalt. So we want to find out if this lives up to the Basalt's great reputation. Let's take a ride and find out. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We really appreciate the support, and subscribing will help us to help you find a great e-bike you'll enjoy. For me, the Asphalt was a really fun bike to ride, mostly because of how fast it can get. It's possible that we received a pre-production model for our testing. Our contact at Mokwheel said that it should ship as a Class 2 and 3 e-bike with the throttle limited to 20 miles per hour and pedal assist up to 28. But ours could go a bit faster than that. Just to be safe though, I'd recommend going into the settings menu before you go out on your first ride, just to make sure things are set up correctly. I thought it was a super comfortable bike to ride though, just generally really smooth. The front suspension fork has 100 millimeters of travel, which is a pretty serious amount for a commuter bike, but I also really liked riding in a very upright posture on the Asphalt, and I thought the handlebars and grips felt really comfortable too. Even the acceleration on the bike was really smooth. It built kind of gradually, and there were plenty of times that I didn't realize I was going as fast as I was. You can adjust that too though, so if you want a bit more of a kick, you can crank up the acceleration, but you can also make it more gradual and smooth if you prefer that. I also really like the Asphalt's handling. It felt really natural to control. The handlebars are a little wider than we typically see on similar commuter cruiser style bikes, and for me, with pretty broad shoulders, that helped the bike to feel really responsive and a bit more comfortable for me. Those were the big things that stood out to me about this bike, so let's move on and talk about its specs and components. So the Asphalt's motor is a 500 watt rear hub motor. That's actually proprietary. Mokwheel has a manufacturing center overseas where they build these, but they told us that they test them to make sure they're on par with some other well-known brands like Bafeng, and I was pretty impressed by what this motor could do. The battery here is 48 volts with 706 watt hours, and I think it's great that it blends into the frame so seamlessly, and I also really like that it has some LEDs that show the charge level here. There's a 7-speed Shimano tourney drivetrain that has a 44-tooth chainring and a 12 to 28-tooth cassette. In my experience, that actually felt pretty limiting here, and it's one of the things I'd like to recommend that the folks at Mokwheel make some adjustments to on the next version of the bike, but I'll save those details for a bit later. The brakes here are hydraulic disc brakes made by Star Union. That's not a big name brand, but we have seen them in the past and they've done pretty decently. The tires are made by Chaoyang, and they're definitely made for, you guessed it, asphalt. That was a really bad pun, sorry. But anyway, this bike comes with a nice commuter package with the rear cargo rack, some fenders, a headlight that's nice and bright. It's got a couple, 2 LEDs. That was cool. And some really great looking taillights and brake lights on the seat stays. The saddle wasn't my personal favorite in terms of shape, but I did like how squishy it was. It's pretty wide in the seat area. So if you do tend to gravitate toward this style of saddle that comes on a lot of cruiser style bikes, I think you'll really dig this one. I talked about the suspension fork a little bit already, but I was actually really impressed with that. The large amount of travel it had handled some areas like some concrete drainage ditches really well. We've got some of those that cross the bike paths around here in a few places, and I actually barely noticed I was riding over them. That was a lot of fun. I also mentioned how much I liked the cockpit here. The grips were great. They're real leather, at least from what we were told by our contact at Mokwheel. And I thought they had some nice texture and they were really easy to hang on to. I'm not typically a big fan of swept back cruiser style handlebars, but I actually really liked these. The wrist angle here felt a lot more natural, at least than when compared to a lot of the others that I've tried. It wasn't so extreme here, and that was cool. The handlebar width, it's 680 millimeters, which that's a little bit wider than we typically see too. I thought it was really noticeable, and I liked how much additional control it gave me. The cockpit layout is relatively standard, but I think it works really well. There's a throttle lever on the left side next to the control panel with the shifter on the right. I had to scoot some of those controls around before I took my first ride. They were kind of packed in pretty close to the grips when we first got the bike, but it felt a lot better after I made some adjustments. And I have to say that as far as that control panel goes, I liked the size and the layout of it, but going by feel, there wasn't a whole lot of differentiation between the buttons. So sometimes I had a little bit of a tough time hitting the right one. So I would have liked to have seen a bit more protrusion on those buttons, or maybe like a rubberized surface, there we go, to make that a little bit easier. But the display is a really great color LCD that's pretty unique to Mokwheel, at least in my experience. I think it's great to look at, but some of the text could be a little tough to read, although overall I think it was well organized. But it took me a little bit of extra time to realize that the lines that wrap around the speedometer on that were actually the battery readout. So I would have preferred to see something a little bit more obvious with the percentage there, but overall I think it worked once I got used to it. So that should be about everything with the Asphalt. Let's move on and talk about those test results. The Asphalt did pretty well in our brake test. We do this to make sure that the brakes are safe, and overall I think the Asphalt setup is. We measured an average stopping distance with this bike of 23 feet and 9 inches, and our average among other commuter style e-bikes is around 21 feet and 2 inches. So that's about 2.5 feet beyond the average. I noticed a bit of a lengthier slowing down than usual in my own testing on the bike, which backs up our data from the brake test. But overall, I think those extra couple of feet, it's not a huge difference, and realistically you can travel that far in the blink of an eye. The brakes here, as I said earlier, are made by Star Union, and we're a little bit less familiar with those, but we have seen them before. These are hydraulic disc brakes, which is always nice to see, and they use 180 millimeter rotors, which I think generally makes sense for a Class 3 bike. I did find the Asphalt to be pretty stable when braking, and that was really appreciated. The rear wheel locked up a bit and the tires could squeal pretty loudly, but I only felt a bit of fishtailing once, and overall that was very manageable. In our speed test, I had a ton of fun thanks to the speeds that we measured on the Asphalt. This is a pretty fast bike that's really capable in its lower pedal assist settings. But that said, there did seem to be a bit of a gearing issue that made it tough to get up to the bike's top speeds in higher assist settings without having to pedal really quickly. Overall, I was pretty surprised by how fast this thing could get with its 500 watt motor though. Its speed isn't really limited by the motor, just by that gearing. We measured about a 4 mile per hour increase in average speed when going from no motor assistance to PAS1. So that's a pretty big jump right away. And then going from there, we saw relatively steady increases in speed, at least by feel. Our data shows a tapering off in speed because we try to pedal pretty casually during this test, and so we actually felt a fair amount of ghost pedaling, especially in PAS5. Right now, that drivetrain has a 44 tooth chainring and a 7-speed 12 to 28 tooth cassette. But I'd like to see a larger chainring, maybe a 46 or 48T, and maybe even a cassette with 8 cogs to give a wider gearing range. I usually feel a lot safer when I'm able to keep up with traffic, and I think this change would make it easier to do that. The Asphalt's results in our range test were pretty solid and lined up well with Mokwheel's advertised range. They say the bike can go up to 60 miles on a single charge using its 706 watt-hour battery, and we measured between about 26 and 53 miles depending on the amount of motor assistance we were using. There are an absolute ton of factors that affect a bike's range, so ultimately we think our low power results are close enough in the ballpark with Mokwheel's. Based on the motor and battery specs though, we expected our max assist test to go a little longer and farther. By doing the math, we should have been able to pedal for about an hour and a half, but ended up only going for an hour before the battery died. So the motor was drawing a bit more power than expected. In the big picture though, the range bracket we measured is about what I expected. Most e-bikes these days tend to fall somewhere in this area, so I think the Asphalt can hold its own when compared to other commuter bikes out there. So how well did the Asphalt do on hills? By the numbers, not the best, but also very far from the worst. Overall, it's pretty average when compared to similar bikes we've tested, but there's also not a ton of those. Bikes with 500-watt rear hub motors and torque sensors are still somewhat uncommon, but they are becoming more popular. On just throttle, we completed the test in 1 minute and 27 seconds at about 12.5 miles per hour, and when pedaling in PAS5, we cut that down to 1 minute and 14 seconds with an average of 14.7 miles per hour. Neither of these results are bad at all, and I actually found when I was riding the bike that it felt really good on more normal-sized hills. The throttle wasn't very fast, but it also didn't struggle at all, so I was really happy to see that, and when I was pedaling, I would say that the bike did very well. It didn't feel like it had any trouble at all, and I liked how the bike's torque sensor delivered more power right when I needed it. The Asphalt was a really interesting bike for me. I really didn't know what to expect from it. I had high hopes, but I think the end result here is really different from anything I've experienced before. Honestly, this is probably one of my favorite bikes that I've tested, and that's weird because it's not outstanding in terms of performance. In every one of the tests that we did, it ended up pretty average when looking at just the numbers, which is fine. But I still think that everything came together to make a really awesome bike. The gearing was kind of the biggest issue for me, especially on a bike that's capable of getting up to 28 miles per hour. I don't really want to have to pedal that fast and hard to get up to those speeds, and so I think maybe some changes like a larger chainring, maybe in addition to an 8-speed cassette, would help that out a lot. And I'm not quite sure what to think about the lack of a speed limit on our bike. Again, it might have been a pre-production model that wasn't quite set up correctly, but again, if you buy this bike, I think it's a good idea to go into those settings and make sure it's going to meet those Class 2 and Class 3 requirements. But more than that, the comfort level of this bike was just kind of perfect in my opinion. Yeah, there's maybe a couple of other little things that I would change, but overall, this is a bike I would absolutely consider buying for myself, and I think it's well-rounded enough to be a daily ride to work, but also something that you can just go out and have fun on. Bottom line, I would definitely recommend the Mokwheel Asphalt. I think it just looks great, it feels great, it handles well, and I'm really pleased to be able to say that. I do want to say a quick thank you for sticking with me today. We'll leave a link to our more detailed written review in the video description, as well as a link to Mokwheel's website so you can check out the Asphalt for yourself. Please use that link if you decide to make a purchase. That helps support us and it doesn't cost you anything extra. Thanks also for hitting those like and subscribe buttons, and feel free to let us know what you think about this bike in the comments section. That's all for today. I'm John with Electric Bike Report, and this is the Mokwheel Asphalt ST.